This is the promised follow-up made in the first pair of screencasts revolving around Lightroom's photo merge feature, allowing users to make both high dynamic range images and panoramas all within Lightroom itself. Precluding or exporting files from Lightroom to accomplish these tasks is in the past, handed off either to Photoshop or third-party HDR building software. In that first movie, I was working with flat-lit images having virtually no contrast built in by way of sunlight or human-made lighting. HDRI has been much celebrated for its ability to compress the often striking disparity between highlight and shadow detail by combining luminance fluctuations recorded by a series of controlled exposures in camera, then providing final images on screen. Even more importantly, as prints that provide detail in both the darkest shadows of a scene and, potentially, its brightest highlight areas. Again, something our eyes and brains can pull off with barely a stutter as we focus on one or the other, or process a scene balancing them both at the same time. In this screencast, I'm going to show you how one might justify the time spent with my previously outlined faux HDR process, using one single camera exposure to build a high dynamic range version of itself, this time by working with a high contrast photograph. I have a substantial archive of pictures I shot over the years in my gardens here in Phoenix, where I live. The quality of light in Arizona is pretty much about as high contrast as it gets anywhere else save for other desert lands in the world. Sometimes it is difficult even for one's eyes to adjust to the brightness contrast here on a particularly bright day without any high clouds or perhaps urban smog or haze to cut down the brightness ratio overall. I have chosen this detail I shot one day at sunrise while a night blooming cereus, an almost tree-like cactus I have in my garden, still had several of its flowers open from the night before. These flowers, the diameter of a dinner plate or a pie pan when completely open, start blooming just after nightfall and quickly start wilting as the morning sun begins to touch their pale white petals. Each flower, which springs from a sort of flute-like appendage that breaks out from the cactus's arm, will bloom only once, then die. I normally have approximately 30 minutes at sunrise to make my photographs. Their demise is so quick you can actually watch them wilt in real time right before your eyes. Because of the whiteness of this flower, the contrast of even early morning light here in the desert, and the present lack of any illumination on pretty much the rest of the garden in the background, this image should be a great candidate for me to show you how this faux HDR imaging process will work on a single photograph that would normally be considered reasonably well exposed. A photograph we all might simply try to fix in Lightroom using the variety of controls available in the Develop module. I have made the DNG file available free to download as a zip file by way of the link I provide in the screencast description below. As you can see in the history panel here, I have only updated the latest process version available in Lightroom and Camera Raw. Nothing else has been affected yet with Lightroom. The overall exposure is just a bit darker than I would prefer, so I will initially increase the global exposure by 0.3 of a stop. I would be satisfied with this tweaked exposure as normal from my camera. But as I said, time is short when working with these flowers. So with my camera set to the manual exposure mode, as I normally do, I made a quick exposure reading zoomed in on one of the flowers before running from one setup with my tripod to the next, in an effort to make as many photos as possible on a morning that provided me about 10 or 12 massive blooms from this cactus tree. And though each frame I shot was more or less normal in exposure, in post-processing here in Lightroom, I can be more critical of what is, in my mind, normal. I now return to the exposure setting in the right column of the Develop module, click on that reading of 0.30 or that 1/3 f-stop increased exposure to make it active, and then press the up arrow on my keyboard 10 times to increase the exposure 1 full f-stop. Please note here, unlike in my first video describing the process for building a faux HDR image with a single image, instead of the usual 3 or more in-camera exposures, I will do things just a little differently in this screencast. I just know there's a lot of luminance tucked away in those deep dark shadows, so I'm going to experiment more with this image. I'm going to push the overall global exposure by several stops and save each additional f-stop worth of luminance as an additional snapshot after completing all my exposure value increases along with a single underexposure version of normal. So here's one f-stop more light. And another. Okay, as you can see here in the history panel, I now have normal, which is the line increasing exposure by 0.30. Then my +1 EV represented by an exposure increase of 1 or 1.30. My 2 exposure value represented by an additional exposure increase of 1, which would be 2.30. And then my +3 EV setting represented by an additional exposure increase of 1, all dutifully recorded by Lightroom. You'll see how convenient this history record is for me in just a moment. I want at least one underexposed version of my HDR image building process, so I go back to the exposure setting, click on the present value of 3.30, and type in -0.70. Then press the return key on a Mac, the enter key on a PC. Use the hyphen key, normally just to the right of the number 0 at the top of the North American keyboard, in order to enter the minus for this exposure setting I am describing. As well, you could alternatively use the minus key in the calculator keypad on an extended keyboard if you work on one with your computer. Note that you have to type in the entire equation here, -0.70, in order to make sure you will achieve the proper one-stop underexposure. Recall that normal is an exposure setting of 0.30. Now I will begin saving my future reminder snapshots, and at the same time building my required series of virtual copies using the history panel's chronological record of the exposure tweaks just completed. The beauty of utilizing this process versus the one I utilized in my first screencast about building faux HDR images is that by carefully working with the history panel, as you will see me do now, I can minimize redundancy in lines of its focused attention to what we do here in the Develop module, as recorded in the history panel. I will be able to abbreviate its record and still accomplish the same thing. I'm not going to get into why I strive to do this as much as possible as I work here in Lightroom. Just let me say that I find the history record Lightroom makes as an important element to my creative workflow, and the cleaner record I can maintain by thoughtfully moving through the process of post-production of my images, the more easily I can find potentially important places to drop in and make amendments one day in the future. That's also a good reason for snapshots, but we won't be going into that here either. I first select the line recording my initial 0.3 of an f-stop exposure increase in my history, and then create a snapshot naming it normal. Then I move up one line in the history where I've added one f-stop or a full EV or exposure value, the exposure setting 1.30. And make a new snapshot calling it +1 EV. Back to my history panel and move up another line there to my next full f-stop or exposure value increase and make my next snapshot +2 EV. To my history a fourth time, selecting the additional full f-stop or exposure value, making my exposure setting 3.30, and then I make my fourth snapshot +3 EV. One last snapshot to go, so I select the top line of history recorded where I drop the exposure on my image to -0.70 and then make it my fifth snapshot, -1 EV. Now to make my virtual copies, I stay where I am currently in the history record, and I employ the keyboard shortcut we learned in the first movie, Command plus the apostrophe symbol on a Mac, Control plus the apostrophe symbol on a PC. Looking to my history panel, I can see only one entry, Create Virtual Copy, plus the date and a timestamp in parentheses. I move back to the original file I've been working with by pressing the left arrow on my extended keyboard, and note how dramatically the history record has just expanded. Then I drop down one line of history, and using the same keyboard shortcut I generate another virtual copy. Then pressing the left arrow on my keyboard to return to my original file once again, I drop down to the third line of history and make another virtual copy. Back again to my original work file and down to the fourth line of history, and I make my last virtual copy. I just need to navigate back one last time to my original file with all those lines of history and select the first line of exposure tweaks, the 1/3 f-stop increase I made a snapshot as normal, and then stop. Note that I am not making a virtual copy of the normal exposure setting. I return to the grid view of the Lightroom library by pressing the G key and look at what there is now to work with. We can see 4 virtual copies, easily identified by the upturned page corner in the lower left of each thumbnail, while you can easily identify the original RAW file because it doesn't have that visual callout embedded into the thumbnail as do the others. Also note that each of the virtual copies have the same file name as the original from whence they were generated. Okay, enough already on details. Let's see what Photo Merge will do as we direct Lightroom to build a high dynamic range image from this series. And please note that to work with Photo Merge in Lightroom, you need either Lightroom 6 or be working with Lightroom CC to continue forward with the Photo Merge feature inside Lightroom. Select all 5 of the files here by clicking on the first, the original file at the start of our just completed series. Then holding down the Shift key, click on the last of the 4 virtual copies to select all 5. Now float your cursor over any of the selected thumbnails and right-click or control-click on a Mac, and when the option window opens, drop down to Photo Merge and then choose HDR to start Lightroom's process on the series. Once again, Lightroom opens the Photo Merge dialog and leave the default settings as you see here: Auto Align, Auto Tone, and keep the deghost amount set at none. Now as Lightroom goes through its computational gymnastics in order to render the final high dynamic range composite of this image, keep in mind the level of magic that is going on under the hood. Lightroom is building an HDR version all from metadata wrapped into a single image. In this case, it is crunching the rendering instructions created for each of the 4 virtual copies and the normal version's rendering instructions initially set for the original camera capture you and I are working with in Lightroom. To me, this is nothing short of remarkable. 1 physical file and 5 sets of rendering instructions that are about to create a whole new, completely independent physical image file. Lightroom will save the new HDR as a DNG, Adobe's digital negative RAW file format. And there you have it, ready for post-processing by simply pressing the D key to move the new file into Lightroom's Develop module. Where Lightroom's HDR process and Photo Merge really shows off as a gift to those of us committed to interpreting our work in a realistic fashion, rather than jumping on the overly saturated and excruciatingly tone-mapped so-called surreal or grunge versions of HDR, is its ability to provide a translation of whatever we decide to record with our cameras as a final image that can appear more like what the most sophisticated imaging device ever built provides us, our eyes plugged into our minds, seeing the world around us. This ability to control the end result in a high dynamic range image building process, compressing tonal range into a manageable rendering for either a backlit screen or even more so as a print for viewing in hand or on a wall, can most benefit images recorded under circumstances with dramatic light. Illumination with a contrast range that neither film nor digital camera sensors can record, maintaining detail present both in the deepest shadow areas and the brightest highlights of our photos. To accomplish all this and keep the closest semblance to reality without falling into the rut of common HDR imagery so prevalent these days has been a sort of holy grail for many discriminating photographers. But after years of experimentation, initially with Photomatix Pro, the first truly refined and well-conceived high dynamic range image building software available to serious picture makers and hobbyists alike, then finding myself immensely frustrated putzing with Photoshop's built-in HDR Pro feature, and then finally finding myself most satisfied with the results I was able to wrangle out of the Nik Collection's HDR Pro 2 application, I still found myself wanting for greater, more believable realism with more expanded dynamic range in my HDR projects. The problem was, no matter how much I danced with Nik's abundance of immensely responsive tone and color settings available within HDR Pro 2, image affecting controls that respond to the touch in real time, a real convenience and key factor in keeping one's eye and mind on the task at hand instead of being distracted by having to wait for software. No matter how successfully I nearly came to realism nirvana, I always found myself mostly happy with my results, yet still wishing for definitive realism capable of fooling the mind's eye. I will now likely save my prior favored HDR building software, HDR Pro 2, only for making high dynamic range images I want for a more interpretively realistic look after spending some time only just recently experimenting with a number of archive photographs from a luxury home tour in my location scouting files using PhotoMerge here in Lightroom. Which brings me back to the HDR building feature in PhotoMerge. I have only recently found by my experimentation that without much coaxing at all, it just happens. No muss, no fuss, realism. Lightroom's PhotoMerge feature does not noticeably increase saturation as does other HDR building software. It does not noticeably increase clarity, structure or tone mapping default settings in software like both Photomatic's and Nik's HDR Effects Pro 2, their software features for building what Lightroom and Photoshop refer to as clarity. And PhotoMerge defaults to one of Lightroom's most remarkable, most often spot-on auto settings crafted into the software since its release in 2007. Auto white balance when rendering its HDR images. I will not stop using Nik's HDR Effects Pro 2 software in the future, as I have too much of a satisfying work experience with that application. The entire Nik collection is a real joy to work with. But if I'm in a pinch for time, or I will need to crunch a faux HDR from a single frame original, providing me a final, most realistic image I can pull loads of tonal variation from in thoughtful post-production utilizing Lightroom, then Photoshop for targeted editing with adjustment layers and attendant masking, Lightroom's PhotoMerge to HDR will now be my go-to application of choice.